Jonno Duniam, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, David.
We'll get to your portfolio in a moment. First, do you think Australia should make a commitment to the security of Taiwan?
Well, the position of the coalition's been made pretty clear by Susan, James Patterson, Andrew Hastie and, of course, more latterly, Angus Taylor, and that is we do want to support the preservation of the status quo, committing to a conflict that isn't on foot. Pre-committing to a hypothetical conflict is not something we're going to enter into. So it is all about that preservation of the status quo. That's our policy. It has been and remains.
So what's Angus Taylor talking about when he says there should be a commitment to the security of Taiwan?
Well, obviously the status quo, of course, means Taiwan remains its own entity, its own arrangement in the current context. So
should we commit to its security?
Well, I think we need to continue to observe what is occurring in that region, continue to understand what China is doing.
Observing is different to committing to the security of Taiwan.
Well, look, I think what we want to do as a neighbour, as someone in the region, is just understand exactly what the arrangements will be. If there are moves, if there are changes, you consider them at that time. Pre-commitment is not something we're going to enter into.
So what's Angus Taylor talking about?
Well, indeed, I've heard subsequent interviews where he's talked about not needing to enter into these hypothetical debates. And
so he's dropped that idea?
Well, the coalition's position remains that we would preserve the status quo.
I think we get the picture. Okay.
You do.
All right. Look, let me get your thoughts on the Tasmanian election. As a Tasmanian senator, your home state, the results, just to remind people, the Liberals sitting on 14 seats at the close of counting last night. That may go up a little. Labor 9, the Greens 5. What do you think? Who's going to form government?
Well, the Premier's already said he's going to seek the support of the Governor to commission another Liberal government, and unless Labor can, from their 9, perhaps 10 seats, work to arrange an 18-seat majority, a locked-in majority, I suspect that's what will happen. Dean Winter, who rolled the dice on this, and you would think if you're going to call for an election, as he did, then you're going to come out with something more than a 3% hit to your first preference votes, and the lowest result on record for the Labor Party. So I can't see how he conceivably can govern.
You can't see, you don't think it's possible that Labor can form government?
Well, look, it is possible, but it would be an unimaginable disaster for there to be a Labor Party that's gone backward in the polls to join up with the Greens and a range of crossbenchers who have all very disparate views about the future of our state. It would send us backward and we'd be back at the polls in no time.
What's interesting, one thing that's interesting, the Liberals recorded a statewide vote last night of nearly 40%. In the May federal election, the Liberal vote in Tasmania sat just below 25%. It's a huge difference. What do you put that down to?
Well, frankly, we ran a bad campaign. We didn't run a campaign relevant to Tasmania. We weren't speaking to their issues. Politics is local, and never has that been more true than in a place like Tasmania. They own their politicians, they own their issues, they want Tasmanian solutions. Federally, we didn't provide that.
Was nuclear power part of that?
It certainly was, because Tasmanians saw nuclear, and I'm a supporter of the policy, but our advocacy for it was seen as anti-Tasmanian. We've got a great renewable scheme down there, the hydro scheme, backed in by wind. They saw our talk of nuclear as undercutting what we had in Tasmania. So that did contribute to our demise there in Tasmania, a significant hit, and there's a lot to learn from that.
All right, let's move to your portfolio. One of the first pieces of legislation the government will introduce when Parliament resumes this week will be to cut funding for childcare operators that are failing to meet national standards. And this follows, of course, the shocking allegations that we've seen in Victoria. Will the Coalition support this bill?
We've had a briefing from the government. We're catching up with them again on Wednesday to go through the detail of the bill, and it is something we do support. Of course, we'll examine the detail. We've got to do everything we possibly can to deal with what is a problem in our childcare sector. Though this legislation only goes so far. Dealing with the payment mechanism and the payment of rebates to childcare providers in response to this is a small part of what needs to be done. The balance of the work needs to be undertaken by state and territory governments, and so we again extend our support to the government to urge state and territory governments to come together and act with urgency to resolve all of the problems we have across the sector.
And I'll come to some of those things that perhaps need to happen at the state and territory level, but on the bill that's coming this week, would you support some sort of public disclosure? So parents, the public, even the stock exchange can see when a centre has been issued with a breach notice?
Yes, I think we do need transparency around this. As a parent, and I'm sure I speak for all parents, when you're putting your child into the care and trust of people you generally don't know and you're away for the day, you want to know if there are issues with the centre you're putting your kid into. So transparency around conditions, any breaches, any problems, I think is important.
Should there be mandatory CCTV cameras in childcare?
I think we do need to. In fact, I'm baffled that it isn't the case that we don't have CCTV. I mean, obviously we need to protect privacy of children. We need to manage those systems. We know that in Victoria there were some issues around the management of CCTV, but with the right safeguards and right management, I think it is essential as part of the protection against kids in this most vulnerable of settings.
I mean, the details can be more difficult there. You know, do you have the cameras in nappy change rooms and toilets, and then who holds that footage? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it would be very unwise for me to start dictating detail around that kind of thing. I think there are tech experts, experts from the childcare field who will know a lot more about that. But there is no reason why we shouldn't be working with them to get the best arrangement possible to prevent this from happening ever again.
What about this debate around whether men should be working in childcare at all? The government's dismissed the idea that you'd ban men working in childcare. What do you think?
Well, while obviously, sadly, the predominant perpetrators here happen to be male, I don't think banning a particular class of worker because of their gender is going to solve the problem. We know that more recently in South Australia, for example, there were cases of female childcare workers perpetrating harm unto children. What we need is a system that catches anyone who is going to treat children badly in these settings, weed them out and prevent them from working in there. We've got to protect kids from anyone who will do harm regardless of gender. One
of the pressing issues is for a national register to be set up that everyone can see, or certainly employers can see, the history of a childcare worker. How much detail do you think that needs to include about work history and why someone's been moved on from a centre?
Well, I think it is important for an employer to know who they're getting into their centre. Again, this is a highly regulated system and set of services for good reason, just like aged care is. If an employee has had substantiated complaints from a previous place of employment in another jurisdiction, I think if I were an employer, I'd want to know. And I think that is essential as part of this registration system and it being national as well.
I guess a big picture question about childcare, one of the problems is just how complicated it is. You know, you've got states and territories doing the regulation, you've got the federal government through the childcare subsidy doing the bulk of the funding, you've got non-profit operators, you've got for-profit listed on the stock exchange operators. It is a bit of a mess. Do you think there's a need to change the structure of the childcare sector, and is there a place still for profit-making operators in childcare?
Yeah, well, the great majority of childcare services provided in this country are for profit. I don't think
two-thirds or something, isn't it? Yeah.
Correct, that's right, just shy of 70%, I think. But I don't think being for profit necessarily is a bad thing. Yes, sure, they want to return investment money to their investors. But at the end of the day, child safety is something that we should be able to ensure is provided for no matter the setting. I think we should have an open conversation about the structure of childcare, but right now, urgent action across all layers of government needs to be undertaken, and we support whatever measures can be done right now.
All right, let's move on. The government will also introduce legislation this week on its election promise to reduce HECS debts by 20%. It'll help some 3 million Australians. Will you support this debt reduction?
Well, I've got to take to Party Room and Shadow Cabinet, of course, our work on that. The Australian people spoke pretty clearly at the last election around the policies the Labor Party took, this being a key one of them. And we're not really in the business of standing in the way of cost of living relief. But I think it is one of those things that Australians wanted, they voted for. We'll go through our process, but I expect this will pass the Parliament.
Well, that's interesting because before the election, the Coalition called this profoundly unfair policy. And there is criticism that it benefits, you know, graduates in medicine and law and high income earning fields more than others. But this sounds very much like you're now going to pass this.
Well, there are criticisms we have, and we continue to hold them, of course. I mean, this is a one-off hit to a cohort of the community funded by everyone in the community. And once it's passed, it isn't in place for future graduates down the track. They'll have their 100% of the bill to pay off. So those concerns remain. At the end of the day, though, the government want to pass this legislation urgently to pass on this relief from HECS debts. That is not going to be something that will be live at the next election unless they want to reintroduce a second round of these. But let's deal with the legislation. We've expressed our concerns. Australians have had their say. We've got to move on.
The government's anti-Semitism envoy has recommended cutting funding to universities who aren't doing enough to stamp out anti-Semitism. Would you support that?
I think it is something that is worthy of consideration. We don't understand how in 2025, in a tolerant, pluralistic society, you can have institutions that might turn a blind eye or allow these sorts of behaviours to occur on campus.
Who should decide that?
Well, I'll allow experts around how managing academic institutions to have that conversation, but as a policymaker, as a lawmaker, I do think that given this issue of anti-Semitism in our country has gone to the levels it has and has dragged on for as long as it has, we have a report that's been provided to government. You had the 15-point plan from the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. We should act on these things. They are formed off the back of evidence and lived experience and responses that need to be put in place. So let's actually do something with it.
The Coalition promised at the election to slash foreign student numbers by 80,000. What's your view now?
Well, obviously, those numbers were part of a discussion that occurred before an election we lost. I think that a lot of the discussion in the lead up to the election, perhaps in that climate, wasn't as constructive as it could have otherwise been. We're looking at all of our policies, and
You're more relaxed about foreign student numbers now?
I think we need to have a proper and open discussion with both the university sector and the community more broadly about how we can approach this. I don't think that any university should, as some have, use international students as a cash cow. That's not appropriate because it's not a good business model. But we need to recognise that a large part of the funding for especially regional universities comes from international students. So a more sensitive conversation needs to be had, and we'll work with the sector and the government about
more sensitive approach on that. Okay, a couple of other questions about your approach in the education portfolio. Peter Dutton promised before the election to tackle so-called woke elements of the national curriculum. Is that a priority for you as well?
I'll tell you what my priority is. When you look at the PISA scores for Australia over the last 20 years, so this is successive governments of every colour, our scores in all the key metrics, maths, reading, science, are all heading south. Investment in students is heading up. Something is not right there. So I'm not worried about specific elements of the curriculum. I'm worried about the foundations in our schools not being taught properly.
Okay, so you're not worried about so-called wokeism in the curriculum?
Well, if we focus on things like reading, writing, arithmetic and kids being able to get those foundational elements right, I think the rest of it will fall away. If we're focusing on the priorities of getting kids out of schools with the best marks possible so they can go into university or higher education, at the best standard possible and become the best graduates, then that will deal with all of the issues people have complaints around, including the woke issues, as they're called. All right.
Do you have any problem, as some of your colleagues do, with transgender girls participating in female school sport?
Well, of course, we need to have an adult debate about these things. It's not one that's been raised with me since the election.
What's your view?
But in terms of transgender girls, I honestly believe that girls' sports should be for girls, boys' sports for boys, and if you have a mixed grouping, then that's something you can arrange by competition or in a school arrangement.
What does that mean for transgender kids?
Well then, if transgender kids are part of a school environment where they are offering sports, then that would be up to that individual school. I know that there are certain schools, even in my own home state of Tasmania, that make provision for transgender children, and that's a matter for them.
So each school should be able to discriminate?
Each school should be able to set up arrangements, I think, that suit their school community. They know their parents, they know their students, they know what's right for their schools. I don't think it's for me to set down who should participate in what sport and what characteristics they have beyond what I've said here today.
Jonno Duniam, thanks so much for joining us.
David, thanks for having me.